Hey everyone, Hasgaha here. I wanted to go over the new camera controls and director mode controls that debuted in Star Citizen Alpha 2.6.0 since it's something I use a lot and see a fair amount of questions about. Hopefully some of you find this tutorial and my breakdown of the system helpful. I'm only covering the in-game camera controls in this video. I won't be going over any of my techniques, tricks, or tips just yet. Those will come in subsequent videos. Please keep in mind that all the key bindings I discuss here are based on the default Star Citizen bindings for a standard US or American QWERTY keyboard layout. And my tutorial is based on the current live version of Star Citizen, which is Alpha 2.6.1. If you're watching this at a later date or patch, please keep in mind things may have changed, and probably have changed. If the changes are significant enough, I'll make an updated or additional video, so check my channel for newer versions. Make sure you check the video description for timestamp links to specific topics in this video if you want to jump ahead or revisit certain sections. I've also put links to some visual guides you can refer to later if that's helpful. And one last thing, I am not a professional photographer in real life, nor do I have any formal training. I'm more of a self-taught hobbyist photographer, and as such, am by no means an expert. Please let me know if I've gotten anything wrong, because it's how I learn and improve. Okay, so the first thing you need to understand is there are three main states of playing the game that have varying camera modes under them. And I define those states as first, character, which is when you're walking around on foot or EVA. Second is ship or vehicle, when you're actually piloting a ship or driving a car. And the third is Spectator, which is currently only active in Star Marine and Arena Commander game modes, which are the quicker competitive arena-style matches. Within each of those states, you have a few camera modes that you can cycle through by pressing F4. And those camera modes are First Person, Chase, and Orbit. And then there's what CIG and many players are calling Director Mode. I consider Director Mode to be all the additional camera controls and functions we now have in Alpha 2.6, which I'll go over in detail. But I wanted to be clear that I consider Director Mode a piece of the overall camera system. Director Mode in my mind does not include character or chase cameras because those cameras lack the additional functionality that comes with the Director Mode key bindings. And I want to make sure I make this point. Even though the various states share similar camera modes and the different camera modes share similar features or functions, none of it is universal. What works in character state Director Mode does not necessarily work in the Spectator mode and vice versa. This is what I believe creates the most confusion when trying to learn the new camera system, but hopefully I can clear all that up. Alright, so back to the three states: character, ship or vehicle, and spectator. Let's start with the character state and work through its three camera modes. You'll be able to use most of this in the vehicle state as well. From your default starting camera mode of first person view in which you're looking through the eyes of your character, pressing F4 once will take you to chase camera. Within chase camera, the camera is fixed a few feet behind your player's head. Wherever you make your character look, the chase cam looks. If you jump or crouch, the camera goes up and down and remains glued to your character's head as if it's attached to a rigid stick coming out the back of your head. We have no control over the placement, position, angle, zoom, or anything else in character chase cam mode. It simply follows us from a set distance and position. From character chase cam, pressing F4 again will get you into character orbit mode, and this is where the magical new director mode lives. When you first enter character orbit mode, it will look and feel very similar to character chase mode. By default, the camera is positioned behind your character's head again, but offset slightly to the right. And again, like chase cam, the default orbit cam is locked to this position behind your character. But it is not linked to your character's head. You can look left, right, up, down without affecting the camera angle. Instead, orbit cam is linked to your character's torso. If you turn your character's head far enough to one side, your character will pivot in that direction, and the orbit camera will then follow the torso. And like chase cam, you can run around and orbit cam will remain glued to you. But that's not what orbit cam is for. It does so much more with the help of director mode controls. From orbit cam, you can apply vertical, up-down, lateral, left-right, and longitudinal, forward and backward, offsets to the camera to reposition it in relation to your character. And you can change the focal lengths, which CIG is describing as changing camera lenses, or the field of view. You can also change the depth of field, or DOF, to increase or decrease a blur effect on objects beyond the focal point. You can also use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out, which is actually different than the longitudinal offset and the focal length zoom. And you can change control from your player's head to the orbit cam by pressing Z or Z, which allows you to rotate the orbit cam around its central point for varying angles and views. This is also known as free look. And while in free look, you can still use all the previous director mode functions. So let's take a closer look at how each of those work. By far, the feature I was most excited about was the ability to offset the camera from the character. If any of you are familiar with the HUDless offset trick I had been using before Alpha 2.6, this replaces it, with positives and negatives. The HUDless trick, which was more of an exploit, is actually still in the game as of Alpha 2.6, but it's much harder to get to, and I'll cover that in another video. Basically, it allowed me to move the camera away from my character infinitely, but only in a vertical line. I could go up and down from my character until my character was out of view, giving me a completely HUDless view for screenshots and videos. It allowed me to go up to the clouds on Arcord if I chose to, and I had 30 minutes to burn. The new offset controls allow us to move the camera not only vertically up and down, but also laterally and longitudinally. So we have a lot more control over camera placement, but the camera is restricted by an invisible sphere with your character at the center. So remember, to use director mode in the character state, you must be in the orbit cam. Starting from first person view again, pressing F4 once will take you to chase cam, and pressing F4 again will get you into orbit cam. Now, to use any of the director mode controls, you must hold the F4 key as a modifier while pressing the actual key assigned to the control. The offset controls are up and down arrows for moving the camera forward and backward, left and right arrows for moving the camera left and right, and page up and page down for moving the camera up and down vertically. The offset controls can be held down for smooth panning as well, or tapped for fine adjustments. The offset controls are relative to your view, not your character. That means if you tilt your view forward and down looking at the ground, F4 and page up move the camera forward along the ground and not up away from it. Think of the offset as controlling your view, not so much a physical camera. And again, the offset controls are constrained to a sphere around your character. So, depending on how you've currently orientated your view, if you push the orbit cam all the way forward using F4 and up arrow, it will eventually stop when it hits the boundary of that sphere. Then, if you try moving the orbit cam left using F4 and left arrow, you'll notice that not only does the camera move left, but it also moves backwards slightly as it rubs against the spherical boundary. It's just something to keep in mind when using the offset controls. Now on to the FOV or field of view control, which basically allows you to step through about 20 lenses with varying focal lengths that change the field of view from wide angle to a narrow zoom. I say steps because it's not a smooth transition, as you can see. Again, to use director mode control, you must hold the F4 key while pressing the bound action key at the same time. To select a wider and wider angle lens, press F4 and numpad plus. To select a narrower and more zoomed in lens, press F4 and numpad minus. These controls cannot be held down for smooth continuous transitions. You must tap them repeatedly. From a real-world photography standpoint, it's like we have a zoom lens that goes from maybe about a 14mm super wide angle and all the way to maybe a 400mm telephoto, maybe more. It's a pretty big range we have to work with. Keep in mind, increasing the focal length using F4 and numpad minus narrows the view, magnifies the image, and flattens out objects, while decreasing the focal length using F4 and numpad plus widens the viewing angle and exaggerates objects that are closest to you, almost like a fisheye lens. Next up is depth of field, or DOF, which is a little harder to understand and even harder to control in-game. An overly simplified translation of depth of field is a blurring of objects in front of and behind the subject, or what's in sharp focus. This is not to be confused with something called bokeh, which refers to the effect produced by the out-of-focus areas beyond the depth of field, or more specifically, the really blurry parts. Technically, depth of field is the distance or zone of acceptable sharpness within a photo that will appear in focus. A higher depth of field means more of the image will appear in sharp focus, and a lower depth of field means a much smaller range of the image will be in focus. Also, the lower the depth of field, the higher the blur effect for objects furthest from the focal point. So first, here's how to do it in-game. Remember, we're still in character state orbit cam because we're using director mode controls. While holding F4, press home to decrease the depth of field, which will reduce the range of sharp focus, blurring objects in front of and behind the focal point. While still holding F4, keep tapping home to continue decreasing the depth of field and increasing the blurriness. To increase the depth of field, which again is increasing the range of sharp focus and decreasing the amount of blur, hold F4 and tap the end key. Like field of view, you have to step through these changes by tapping the keys. You cannot smoothly and continuously transition through the changes by holding the keys down. So maybe you're asking yourself, how do I work with depth of field? Well, brace yourself, I'm going to give you a real dumbed down photography lesson. The three main factors that affect depth of field in real-world cameras are aperture or f-stop, distance from the subject to the camera, and the focal length of the lens. We have no control over aperture in the game, so forget that one. We can control the distance from the subject by either moving our character or using offset controls to move the camera. And we can control the focal length by changing lenses, also known as the field of view. What makes depth of field difficult to control in-game is that we have no way of arbitrarily setting the focal point. For example, in a real camera, you can pick a point to focus on, whether it's 3 feet from you or 30 feet. In-game, the focal point is a set point within the invisible offset boundary sphere. We can, however, move the focal point around within the sphere with the offset controls, but we can never set the focal point outside of that sphere. That means we can't focus on a distant object in the background and blur the foreground. Next up is what in the key bindings is referred to as mouse zoom, but it's not a zoom in the traditional photography sense of the word. Zoom implies a changing of the focal length, which changes the field of view while narrowing the view angle and magnifying the image. Mouse zoom does not do that. It acts more like an offset control that moves the camera longitudinally, but is not bound by the offset sphere boundary. Mouse zoom also does not change the focal point, which means it has no effect on depth of field. Something like this does not exist in real-world photography, at least not by itself. For those photography-minded folks, this mouse zoom is the equivalent of physically walking forward or backward with your camera while also adjusting the focus to maintain a set focal point. It's just weird. But it does allow us to position the camera longitudinally well outside the offset sphere. And when used correctly in conjunction with the offset controls to set the focal point and depth of field to control the blur, it can create some very interesting images. Anyway, using it is simple enough so long as you have a mouse with a scroll wheel. Scrolling up or away from you pushes the camera forward, while scrolling down or towards you pulls the camera backwards, and that's it. One of the director mode controls that we've always had available to us is free look. Free look is toggled on and off by pressing the Z or Z key, without holding the modifier F4. When on, free look allows you to swing the orbit camera 360 degrees around its current focal point using the mouse. It is not affected by the offset boundary sphere, and is only limited by collisions with other objects like the floor, walls, other players, and so on. While free look is active, you will not be able to orient your character with the mouse, but you can position the camera in free look and then turn off free look to reposition your character as needed. It's important to understand that the free look pivot point is not your character, but rather your focal point as set by the offset controls. Conveniently enough, we also have the ability to save and reload up to 9 camera views that includes the field of view, depth of field, offset, mouse zoom, and free look angle. Once you have a camera view set that you'd like to save and possibly reuse again, press and hold the F4 key while then holding any of the 0 through 9 numpad keys for about 3 to 5 seconds. Holding the key for a few seconds is important because to recall that saved view, you tap the F4 key and the numpad key you saved the view to. Unfortunately, the saved views are not persistent. As soon as you die in any game mode, whether it's Arena Commander dogfighting, or Star Marine first-person combat, or in the universe or ArcCorp, any saved camera views will be lost. Now that you've possibly totally screwed up your orbit cam, you can reset it back to its default position, field of view, depth of field, and zoom by pressing F4 and the number pad asterisk. This merely returns the current view to its default state. It will not erase any saved views you've created. And that is all for the character state camera modes. Now on to the vehicle state. Since the vehicle state camera modes have a lot in common with the character state camera modes that I just covered, I won't go over them in exhaustive detail. So again, vehicle state applies to any time you are piloting or driving some vehicle. Right now it seems that if you're in a station seat on one of the larger ships like the Starfarer's shield station, or a co-pilot seat, the normal character state is active, not the vehicle state. The vehicle state has 3 and sometimes 4 camera modes which are very similar to the character state camera modes, and they are first person, in which you're looking through the eyes of your character while behind the controls of a vehicle. Chase cam is an external view of the ship, much like the character chase cam, but unlike character chase cam, a lot of the director mode functions are available. Then vehicle orbit cam is an external third-person camera centered on the vehicle that is identical to the character state version of the orbit cam. And finally, passenger orbit cam, which is an external third-person camera very similar to vehicle orbit cam, but instead of being centered on the vehicle, the orbit camera is centered on your character in that vehicle. But it doesn't seem to be available for every ship and vehicle right now. Alright, from your default starting camera mode of first-person view in which you're looking through the eyes of your character, pressing F4 once will take you to chase camera. Vehicle chase cam differs from character chase cam in that there is a slight and gentle sway to the vehicle chase cam. This gives a little life to your chase cam views. Another aspect of vehicle chase cam that is vastly different than character chase cam is that vehicle chase cam allows you to use all the additional director mode controls except for free look. You can use the offset, depth of field, field of view, and mouse zoom controls, but you cannot pivot the vehicle chase camera around by pressing Z or Z and using free cam. From Vehicle Chase Cam, pressing F4 again will take you to Vehicle Orbit Cam, which starts at the bow of the vehicle looking back at your character. And again, Vehicle Orbit Cam is functionally the same as Character Orbit Cam. You'll have all the same director mode functions. After Vehicle Orbit Cam, things change. Depending on which ship you're in, you might have one extra camera mode. I don't have access to all the vehicles to test this, so I can't verify when this mode is active, but pressing F4 from Vehicle Orbit Cam will either take you back to First Person Cam, or you'll enter what I'm calling Vehicle Passenger Orbit Cam, which has all the same features as the regular Vehicle Orbit Cam. Yes, it's another Orbit Cam, but where the first Vehicle Orbit Cam is centered on the middle of the vehicle and its offset sphere is centered on the middle of the ship, this Passenger Orbit Cam is tied directly to your character inside the vehicle. The other oddity of this camera mode is that the camera cannot pass behind the character. Using free look, you cannot pivot the camera around to behind the character. It hits an invisible barrier. I rarely use this mode since it's a more restrictive form of the Vehicle Orbit Cam and I haven't found any real benefit to it. But it's there, for some ships. I was able to access it in my Avenger and a rented Gladius. But I was not able to access Passenger Orbit Cam from a borrowed Caterpillar and a forcefully borrowed Constellation. And that wraps up the character and vehicle state camera modes. Now on to spectator mode. I'm not going to go real deep into this as I expect this part of the camera system to change significantly over time. I'll touch on the basics and give a real brief overview, but talk more about how to actually access spectator mode. Put simply, spectator mode allows you to act as a viewer rather than a player. Instead of controlling an avatar or a character or vehicle, you're a floating camera with varying degrees of control dependent on a number of factors. And because spectator camera is not attached to a character or vehicle, the view does not sway back and forth at all like it does for chase camera or orbit camera. It is a completely still camera. Right now, as of Alpha 2.6.1, spectator mode can only be used in the electronic access game modes of Arena Commander, which are the dogfighting and racing arena game modes, and Star Marine, which are the first-person shooter arena game modes. That means spectator mode does not work in the Universe, Arc Core, or the Hangars. And there are two ways in which to activate spectator mode, but they don't work for all the electronic access game modes. The first is automatically activated each time you die in a match but before you respawn, and I call this Death Spectator mode. And the second is by joining or creating a private match and selecting the Join as Spectator option in the game lobby screen. As far as I can tell, the Death Spectator mode can be accessed in almost every electronic access game mode, except Racing, which forces an immediate respawn and does not give you time to spectate. To access this Death Spectator mode, simply die by any means and do not press X to respawn. The Death Spectator mode can take a few seconds to kick in, but when it does you should see some control tips at the bottom of the screen and a status message that says Spectating. At the bare minimum, you will be able to click the right and left mouse buttons to cycle through available targets to spectate from. In some game modes, like an Arena Commander dogfighting match, cycling forward and backward through spectating targets will make your camera jump between the various other ships in the match. Sometimes these are chase cameras, sometimes they are passenger cameras. And yet in other game modes like a Star Marine elimination match, clicking the mouse buttons will cause you to cycle through various environment cameras, not character cameras. In some game modes like Arena Commander Free Flight, Squadron Battle, Battle Royale, and a few others, you can actually detach from your target and have a completely free-roaming free cam in Death Spectator mode with all the director mode functionality like focal length and depth of field. You can do this by pressing the Z or Z button. You can control the spectator free cam just as you would your character in first-person view mode. The WASD keys move the camera longitudinally and laterally, while the spacebar and control keys move the camera vertically, like jump and crouch would. And the mouse allows you to pivot the view around and change your longitudinal direction. Since the WASD keys move the untethered free camera, the director mode offset controls behave a little differently, and more like a real-world focus ring setting the focal point. In character and vehicle director modes, the offset control would move the camera. Here in spectator mode, using the up and down arrow keys to affect the longitudinal offset does not move the camera, but does actually move the focal point closer and further away from you. And on top of that, the distance that the focal point can be set at appears much greater than that of the character and vehicle director modes. Here I push the focal point from the platform I'm positioned on all the way across the map to the other platform. This free cam ability used to work in Star Marine elimination mode, but has been removed from all Death Spectator mode Star Marine cameras. All of these controls and abilities for Death Spectator mode that seem to be game mode or match type specific appear to be the same whether you're in a public, private, or single player match. One thing I need to point out, and I hope CIG changes eventually, is that while in this Death Spectator mode, not only will the match timer, score, and various other game UI elements still be present on the screen, but so will the giant "press X to respawn" prompt. The only bit of the UI that we can hide is the Spectator mode hints at the bottom of the screen. You toggle those on and off by pressing the B as in boy key. And no matter the game mode, if you're done using the Death Spectator mode, simply press X to respawn and rejoin the match. The second way of getting into Spectator mode is by loading into a private match initially as a spectator. This is currently only available in private matches, and once you start a match as a spectator, you cannot leave Spectator mode until all rounds within that match finish or you leave the match. This purer form of Spectator mode comes with a few advantages over the Death Spectator mode. For one, it's available in all game types in both Arena Commander and Star Marine. And also, it lacks two rather intrusive UI elements present in Death Spectator mode. The spectator status and key hints at the bottom, and the press X to respond prompt are not in this spectator mode. This gives you a much cleaner frame to work with. The round timer and score are still present though. And if you're interested in covering matches as a commentator or other esports style capacity, know that the player names are not visible to spectators. But as a pure spectator, you'll have a completely detached and free roaming camera with all the normal director mode controls in all electronic access game modes. While this new camera system is a fantastic tool and a great step forward for people who like in-game camera options, there are a few things I hope to get addressed moving forward. One control that is missing that other games usually have is the ability to roll or tilt the camera. We just don't have that. And like I mentioned earlier, we can't set a focal point independent of the offset position. This, to me, being a non-game developer, seems like a more complicated thing to include, but would really be nice to have. And then looking way forward, I'd love to have aperture f-stop control as well. And one of the most annoying features of the camera is the sway or bobbing effect that comes with some of the camera modes. Sure, when filming a flying ship it adds a nice dynamic and organic feel to the movement, but trying to line up a complex static screenshot and having to compete with the camera sway is very frustrating. Ideally, I'd like the ability to toggle this on and off. Oh, and the inability to disable the UI in spectator mode, again, to be able to toggle that would be nice. All that being said, I don't consider any of these things a high priority in the grand scheme of the game. I see all of this camera stuff as a bonus, and I'll take whatever I can get. And that's it. I'd like to thank my fellow crackpot camera junkies for helping me out. People like Relum Monk and the Damn Shames group, along with myself, have been sharing anything and everything we learn about the Star Citizen camera system with each other. This tutorial was my effort at combining our collective knowledge dump into a more accessible and easier to digest format. Also, I don't pretend to be an expert on any of this. If I've made any mistakes, haven't explained things clearly enough, or if you have questions, let me know in the comments below. In the future, look for videos detailing some of my tricks and techniques that build on this base understanding of the camera system. Thanks for watching, and please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you found this video helpful.